Hey, let's discuss weaving today. Soon you will be starting your weaving project and you will be weaving on a loom that looks similar to this one. Yours might be slightly shorter, it might be slightly wider, but this is a basic chipboard loom. The strings are going to be in the weaving that you're doing are going to be in this section of the loom, and we have these little notches at both the top and the bottom that allow your warp strings to be able to grab onto the loom and stretch from one end to the other of the loom. Now, I mentioned the idea of warp strings. Basically, what weaving is, it is a process of merging together two different types of fibers. It's typically done with yarn, but you could weave with things like grasses, ribbons, different types of strings, any type of fiber basically would work really well for weaving. We will be using yarn for our weaving for this project. Okay, setting up your loom requires you to understand the difference between warp threads and weft threads. Warp threads, you can see here in this illustration, are the lines. In this case, they'll be strings that stretch the whole length of the board. The warp runs from the top to the bottom of your loom. So this is a loom that has not yet been strung, and what you'll find is that the warp threads will grab onto these notches and they'll stretch all the way down to the other end of the board on those tabs as well too. So the warp threads go up and down. I like to try to remember it like when I say the word warp, it seems to take a little bit longer when I say it like that, so that helps me remember that the warp threads are nice and long ones. Weft is going to be the colored strings that you choose to weave with. Weft goes from left to right and back again from right to left. Left to right, right to left. Left to right, right to left. And you can see in this illustration here that to merge those two different fibers together, the weft goes over and then under the warp strings. So you can see it's above, it's below, it's above, it's below, it's above, and then when you come down to the next row, the exact opposite happens about what happened in the first one. So if we ended a row over, we'll start the next row under, and it's a very repetitive process just like that. Over, under, over, under, over, under, back and forth, all the way down the entire length of your loom. That is the entire weaving process. It's just repeating the same steps over and over and over again. Here we have a loom that's been strung already. So we have a loom that's been strung already. You can see that the warp threads have been pulled around those notches. If we look at the back of the board, both ends of the secured warp threads have been taped down. So the warp threads go around the notches, down and around, and they're nice and secure. This board is ready to start weaving on. What you'll also notice is on either side of the warp threads, you can see this black line. This black line indicates how wide your weaving should be while you're weaving. One of the most common problems that happens when students are weaving is that they tend to pull a little too tight, and it makes the weaving process much harder than it needs to be. But more about that in just a little while. So we have our loom, we're ready to get started. What we need to do is get a piece of yarn. So I have a piece of yarn here, and you can pick any color or colors that you would like to weave with. Obviously, one string at a time, but you're welcome to change colors as you work. To start the process of attaching this to the warp thread, so this is going to be our weft thread. This is what's going to eventually go back and forth through the warp threads. I need to secure this weft thread to my warp thread. I typically start in the upper left-hand corner of the first warp, and what nice and secure. So when you are tying a knot, so let's get a close-up view of this here. When you're tying a knot, the weft thread is going to go onto this warp thread. Take your weft, weave it underneath the warp. Can you see how my orange thread is now underneath my gray thread? So my weft is underneath my warp. And what I want to do is I tend to pull a little bit of a loop. So I'm creating a loop. I've created a loop. And do you see that the end of my warp is over itself? So I've created this little sort of loop that's right here. Now what I want to do is to try to take the end of my weft. I'm going to lift this up and I'm going to tuck the end of my weft inside of that loop. It almost kind of looks kind of pretzel-like, not quite, but something similar to that. So I'm going to take my fingers here and I'm going to take my fingers here. I'm going to pinch those tight, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull those in the opposite direction, and that creates a simple knot. Sometimes, if you want more security, you can double it up, but it's the same exact process. So you make another loop. You can see my weft is over itself. It's over it. I'm lifting up this little loop, and I'm tucking this right inside. And I'm going to hold, and I'm going to pull. And now I've created a double knot. And that's really a very secure type of knot. You don't necessarily have to double your knot, but sometimes it does help to get those two pieces secured together. Okay, now we are ready to start weaving. So the goal of weaving is to take this weft thread and weave it underneath and over these warp threads. When I tie a knot for the weft onto the warp, I always consider this one to be over. So my next one, I want to do the opposite of what happened here. So if this is over, my next one needs to go under. And let's zoom in on this just a little bit here. So if this is over, I want to pick up this warp thread and I want to put this one under. So I'm going to put this one under, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull that through so we can see that now my weft is under this warp. If this one's under, the next one needs to go over. So I'm going to get this back on the side. So that one's going to go over, and then now we're going to go under this one. So under that one, over this one. Under this one, over that one. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to pull it straight through. And I'm going to watch. When I'm pulling, I want to keep my warp threads nice and parallel to one another. Keep your warp threads parallel. If you pull too hard, watch what happens when you do this. If you pull too hard, do you see how your threads are starting to get unparallel? They're really narrow here. They're still kind of wide here, but these are way too close. I'm pulling too hard, and that's one of the most common things that students do. So watch. When you're pulling your weft thread through, don't let the warps move. This Sharpie line that's right here on both sides of that loom board, your warp threads should stay in line with that. They should stay right on top of those, right next to those. So that helps you keep your weaving nice and wide, okay? So now for my next row. When I finished my first row, I just go ahead and go directly into my second row until I've run out of length of thread, okay? So if I finished over, let's zoom back in again a little bit. If I finished over this one, my next row needs to start under. On this first row, I went from left to right. Now I'm going to go from right to left. So same process. This one's under, this one's over. This one's under, this one's over. This one's under, over, and under. And again, go ahead and gently pull your weft string through there. Watch as you're getting towards the end. Right now, I'm pretty good as far as how tightly I've pulled. Now, if I'm not paying attention and I keep pulling, watch what happens. Oh no, there go the warp warp strings. They're not parallel anymore. We shouldn't see that Sharpie line so far away from the final warp. So, oh gosh, if you see that happen, stop and fix it immediately. So all you have to do is loosen it up a little bit and then tuck those up there. And you see how your lines are getting nice and parallel still? So your warp threads need to stay nice and parallel. So the next row, I do the same thing that happened here. If I ended under, I start over. That's right. So over, under, over, under, over, under, over. Pull through. Watch as you're getting close to the end and just really gently let that touch that edge of the warp string and tuck it up just like that. So you would continue this process over and over and over and over again until you get to the end of your string. And then I'll show you how you take, well, I'm out of this string. What do I do? How do I get another string attached? Okay, maybe now you have finished weaving, you've taken your weft string and you've woven row by row, left to right, right to left, over, under, so on and so forth, and you've come to the end of this and you need to get started with your next string, but you're not quite sure how to get that attached, okay? Step number one, what you don't want to do when you are weaving your weft thread, you don't want to weave such to a point that you're left with just a tiny little tidbit of it. This is way too short, okay? You need to leave enough so that way you have enough length to be able to easily tie in a knot the next string that you plan on using, okay? What I usually do is if you're having difficulty tying knots, an easy way to go about this is once you've got enough length to tie with, take your second string, lay it out on the table just like this. And then I usually, just like we used a loop here for this one, I do the same exact process. So I take both of them together and then I go ahead and I make a loop. So both tails, both ends, those tails have been made into a loop and they are passing over both of those weft threads. I then hold on to that loop. I take those tails and I tuck them right through that hole. So almost like we're getting another one of those pretzels made, okay? So you can see my tails are through there. I'm holding both tails. I know it's hard to see. And I hold here. So I firmly have these. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull those. And then I end up with this nice knot. Okay. Now, a lot of students worry about the strings that are here. Don't worry about those strings. You can take care of cutting those later. I would not recommend cutting them early because if you cut it too close to the knot, sometimes that makes your knot unravel and then your weaving becomes pretty loose. Now, once you have those tied, you are ready to get started with continuing weaving. So we pretend like that knot's not even there. We start the next row. So if I end it over, I'm just going to go ahead and go under, over, under, over, under, over, and then pull that through. And this knot is just going to pull straight through there, okay? So far, it's enough length that it hasn't quite buried itself in there. So I'm going to do that. Next row that I do, we'll see that this is going to stop about right here, and that's all we do. We just pretend like the knot's there. Knot's not there, and we go ahead and just keep weaving. So I ended under, the next row needs to be over. That's correct. So over, under, over, under, over, under. I'm going to pull that through and watch what happens with this knot. So when I'm weaving, it just gets itself right into the middle of my weaving, okay? These tails that we have from this, ignore them. You'll take care of those later, okay? So that's just going to become part of the weaving. So what we're looking at right now, when you're weaving on this board, this is actually the back side of the weaving, okay? The front side is next to the board, and you can't quite see that until we take it off the loom, which is for another day, okay? So just like that. So over, under, over, under, over, under. Same process, a very repetitive process, time and time and time again, okay? Just make certain, be careful that you're not pulling hard. You want to make certain that your warp threads are staying nice and parallel. And when this second string finishes, same exact process that we did here for every other string that comes comes afterwards. Make certain as you're weaving, you're tucking your weaving up, keeping it nice and tight. If it's looking really loose, like if it's looking really loose like this, you want to keep it nice and even and keep it tucked up so that way your weaving's as strong as it can be.